Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Oxo 2 on this bitterly cold morning. Thank you for braving it. I'm Hugh Taggart, one of the co-managing directors of Engage by Bell Pottinger, and it is our pleasure to welcome you here this morning for the 2017 Rules of Engagement breakfast in conjunction with the Future Laboratory. Every year starts with a flurry of forecasts about the coming year, and in that respect, 2017 is no different. However, the sweeping political and social changes that shook 2016 have forced us to reset the boundaries of how businesses interact with the outside world. As communications professionals, we will be on the front line of that change. It will be our roles to promote new ways of thinking, share fresh stories, shape the way we do things, and also explain company decisions. So in that respect, our roles and the challenges that we face have never been more complex. But it is our view that the companies that will embrace today's complexities and engage meaningfully with their stakeholders will be the ones that flourish. This morning, Trevor Hardy from the Future Laboratory is going to give a snapshot of just some of the macro trends that affect the decisions that we make every day. And then myself, James Tomlinson, the co-managing director of Engage, Claudia Bate and Andy Bloxham, two senior partners within the agency, are going to attempt to provide some communication solutions that we believe that brands should, at the very least, consider when trying to tackle some of these challenges in the coming year. We hope that everyone in the room finds the discussion interesting, and also those people not in the room. We are attempting to live stream this event today. And in the spirit of engagement, we ask that you do so via the hashtag BPEngage if you would like to share any of the content from today's discussion with any of your followers. I would ask that if you do have any questions, that we leave those until the end of the discussion. And then, without any further ado, I will ask Trevor to kick things off.
Thank you, Hugh. As Hugh mentioned, I work for the Future Laboratory, and we are a futures consultancy, generally helping our clients be more informed, more prepared, and more confident about where the future is going, where businesses and brands and consumers and where innovation may come from in the years ahead. But one of our primary departments at the core of our company is a division that researches and analyzes and documents the forces shaping 14 different industry sectors on a global basis. And whilst today we won't be talking about global issues specifically, and we won't be talking about sector-specific issues, we're going to focus on 5 major forces, 5 major trends that we think might impact brands and marketing and communications over the coming year. And we're going to do so very, very briefly, just in the interest of getting through some interesting commentary and, of course, the attempted actions and implications. So the way today will be structured is that I'll start very briefly to describe one trend, one force that might shape different impacts on brands or marketing or comms. And then I'll turn over with a question to the Bell Pottinger team to think about the implications or the actions that we might have. And we'll finish with a resolution on things we might want to think about as communicators for how we might tackle these trends. And I guess the good thing about a resolution now, it is a perfect time on the 25th of January for a professional resolution, because if you're anything like me, you've completely defaulted on all the personal resolutions you made only a few weeks ago. So why don't we get started? The first of 5 trends today. We'll start with a really meaty one, for no other reason than just to start in a provocative area, but this notion of a complete breakdown in trust. And this is something that we've seen over the course of years happening and growing, but 2016 was a year where it reached almost a crisis point, where we had seen the degradation of trust in government bodies and politicians, in broader social structure organizations. But last year and over the recent months, there's been a breakdown in trust in places that we thought we could always rely on. Whether that was brands that might have had emission scandals or phone scandals, but brands that we always thought would be there for us. Or sports bodies that we thought were whiter than white, that had massive issues that depleted our trust. And this trust breakdown has caused a lot of uncertainty for people, for consumers, and their ability to trust the bodies that would normally be providing stability and certainty in a world that was constantly changing. But the problem isn't trust. The problem for us is how we gain trust. And the levers, the tools that we always used are becoming less effective than they used to be. And I suppose that's to line up this rather chunky question, I suppose, but is when we're thinking about how we build trust, this essential thing with consumers, the old ways of doing it, that we might rely on heritage, our years of experience, successes in the past, to always tell consumers that we'll be there for you in the future because we've been there for you in the past, isn't as potent a tool as it used to be. So how will brands and how will communicators regain and rebuild trust in this very, very changeable year?
Well, I think to answer this big chunky question, that you're right in terms of how you outline that. I think the likes of track record won't, and past successes and heritage won't be as powerful as they once were. Although track record, it should be said, will always count for something. Trust doesn't just get manufactured overnight. Indeed, it takes a long time to cultivate. And as we know, trust takes a lot less time to actually be broken. But relying on heritage, past successes, etc., will become increasingly less significant than the likes of demonstrating absolute transparency and honesty with stakeholders every day. I think until this point, corporates have had a foot in both camps. They've been quite happy to retreat into their corporate shell when it suits them and rely on some of those past performances. And they've also been quite happy to reap the benefits of increased engagement when they are actually transparent with their stakeholders. But in 2017 and beyond, I don't think they're going to have that luxury. And brands will live and die by what they do and how they behave in today. I think consumers, this is largely because consumers have far greater power than they ever did before, and they have far greater choice than they did before. Indeed, investors also have unprecedented levels of information and access, and we've seen this in open and honest about their activities and their dealings. I think the best, most recent example of this is the McDonald's Our Food, Your Questions campaign, where they were entirely honest and laid bare something that would have been internalised and antagonised over internally, and actually provided the questions that people were answering in a far more publicly marketed campaign. And they did this with great success. They found that it was a very powerful way to engage with new audiences. They felt that the transparency also gave them the opportunity to talk and showcase their corporate values. And I think they were also able to dispel some of the mistruths around things like produce and sustainability. So from that respect, it has been incredibly powerful.
Very good.
In terms of...
But what do we do about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the really hard thing, and I can see some of my clients in the room, and they're probably going to look in absolute horror when we say that the first thing we think we should do is untrain or unpack the chief executive.
Personally, do you mean? Or?
Well, we go to enormous lengths, I think, to train chief executives, to train leadership teams on what they should say and how they should say it. But I think there's probably 3 points here that we would like to get across today in terms of how we think the leadership can be used and tactics that they should deploy. The first is establishing or adopting this element of candour and humility. Like humans, brands are fallible. They make mistakes, and leadership, I think, needs to reflect this and embody this. We want to see people behind the title. We don't just want to see the chief executive. We want to see the actual person behind that. And I think there are some pretty good examples. I think Stephen Kelly from Sage is a wonderful example in terms of how he engages, particularly on social media channels. I think he's active on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And in that, he gives something of himself, not just something about the brand. It's really about him and his beliefs and his passions. The second thing here is lifting the lid a little bit on some of the inner dealings or the inner workings within a company. We go, again, to great lengths to try and cover up or disguise some of the thinking and the work that goes into arriving at certain decisions. But I don't think there's any harm in actually explaining how you arrived at certain things. And I think some companies are better doing it than others. I worked at Betfair in the early 2000s, and they were wonderfully transparent in terms of their dealings with consumers, regulators, sports bodies, and they made everything absolutely readily available. They had an audit trail which they were able to share with regulators, and this gave them a lot of credibility and transparency in the market. It made life very hard initially, but ultimately they won a lot of support by being transparent. I guess the other, perhaps more recent example of this in the financial services sector has been NatWest's campaign, the We Are What We Do campaign, where they are incredibly frank about the mistakes that they have made, and in doing so, they've really set out their corporate positioning. So that was an interesting example. The third tactic that we are going to recommend is just to ensure that when we do formal presentation training, is that we try and bring across this element of authenticity. I think what we want to do here is just sort of break some of the old habits that we're used to and focus on real and genuine interactions with the chief executive or whoever it is. And it doesn't always have to be the chief executive as well. I think what we're trying to establish here is a leadership group that understands what their stakeholders want to hear and actually humanise the whole process.
Wonderful. Excellent. Should we move to number 2?
I've probably frightened everyone enormously.
Right, so I guess in a very related way, this sense of credibility, how we restore credibility is one of the areas that's been disturbing, I suppose, the media industry in its broadest terms, and especially when it comes to this notion of hyper-fragmentation and the proliferation of more and more media options, media channels, content is a much maligned word, a much overused word, but the combination of massive explosion in forms of content and channels with technological innovation that allows anybody to be a publisher, a media channel, with an interest in content creators and an attraction to people finding new forms of content and new content creators, has created a different kind of model that we are feeling is in a mid space in a way. It's not in its final form, but it's in a place where a lot of us in the media industry and the communication and brands industries are feeling, I guess, uncertain or unsettled about the nature of fragmentation and where that's heading, if there's going to be reaggregation because of massive algorithm, massive bodies, or continuous defragmentation to the point where things feel less stable than they are today. But the real challenge is going to be how can brands or people who capitalize on editorial content find much more fluid, agile ways of working. And for those of us who depend on having our brand messages within very credible editorial environments, how can we reestablish the qualities of editorial? It's going to be one of the major challenges this year, and one of the things we see affecting especially the media industries. But I guess one of the questions for us to address is, we seem to be in this middle space, this waiting space. We know that the current media models are not perfect and are breaking down a little bit. We have no idea what the future, the optimized media models may be. So how can brands and communicators do their very best this year whilst we're waiting for the dust to settle on where media and media fragmentation may end up?
Thanks, Trevor. So, excuse me. I think, just to build on that point slightly, I think in the medium term, we're entering an area where the platform is king, where it's the controller, it's the conduit by which we consume most of our content. People are going to fewer places but they're consuming more types or more fragments of content in those places that they go to. So those platforms are key, and the kind of traditional media giants are evolving now, but they're going to have to evolve further. And I think their options in that medium term kind of break down into 3 or 4 areas. They can either withhold their content from some of those platforms and find other means of distributing it. They can identify a preferred platform, either one that's here already or perhaps one that's coming up, or they can club together and form a new platform for their own interests or for their own industry. Or I guess a fourth option will be a combination of all 3. A good model of that, which incorporates elements of all of those, is in music streaming, where we've seen all of those elements play out over time, and I think that's going to affect print and online media and eventually broadcast media too, through that route. At the same time, in terms of editorial versus advertising, if they're 2 ends of the scale, we're seeing the grey area in the middle expand, and today and for a couple of years we've seen that evolve, where there are increasing opportunities to exploit or to make use of that grey area. A good example is Forbes, where their content management system was open to brands, to advertisers, to post content of their own. The demarcation of editorial from advertorial to sponsored content, all those boundaries are slightly shifting and blurring. And in the meantime, there are tremendous opportunities to use those existing platforms to post your messages, to put your content up there. Yeah.
Great. And then what is the best way for brands, what's the best way for communicators to start to think about how they can innovate ahead of some of these changes?
So I think the key point is you should buddy up. You've got to recognize that you can't tell all of your stories by yourself. And that might sound obvious, but I think people aren't necessarily being or grasping that challenge as fully as they might. The black book of contacts of the traditional influencers needs to be extended. I mean, the traditional media remain very strong. I mean, don't get me wrong. But people need to look again and make sure that they're using social channels properly to really develop this storytelling, and also to engage online influencers. And these all exist in lots of different places, but you need to go to those places, and as we'll come back to later, I think, and make sure you're telling your story through other people. Also, brand partnerships are vital, and it's not just the kind of consumer style brand partnerships like Lego with Marvel and all the films that have churned out of that partnership, but it's also things like Alcantara, which is a B2B materials brand, makes all kinds of innovative materials, and they seek to position themselves as a high-end lifestyle brand. So one of the things they did is they teamed up with La Scala, the opera house in Milan, to create the set and all the costumes for a stage of an opera entirely with their material, and clearly that not only demonstrates the flexibility and the kind of values of their material, but it also puts it in front of the right kind of audience. Finally, if you are operating in that grey space between, or in that mixed zone between pure editorial and advertising, if you're telling a story there and you're doing it yourselves, you need to have really high quality, almost journalistic stories in different formats, will be repurposed and carried by your communities out to your wider audiences. But I think coming back to that story and artfully weaving in all of your messages is the way to answer that question.
I think the other point I would add to that, which Andy said, it's about collaboration. And we've seen a lot of brands, again, some clients in this room, who actively work with influencers, with some of their consumers to co-create that content. Because they recognise that perhaps not only do some of these influencers, Instagrammers, YouTubes have tremendous quality and production values, they also have that additional audience that it would take ages for brands to reach on their own.
And how, I guess last question on this, how do you think that brands could make themselves more attractive to potential contributors and creators so that it becomes a very symbiotic?
I think one of the best examples of a client we work with is Air France KLM. They're very open with who they work with. They're very targeted with who they work with, and they give their influencers and their consumers unique experiences. I think that's one of the trends that we'll talk about later, about taking people out of their everyday norm, giving them a unique experience, and enabling them to learn something new that they didn't necessarily know they needed.
Yeah, lovely, wonderful, excellent. So trend number 3, moving swiftly along, is one that is both really uncomfortable, but I love it. I love it just because we've had years that some of us who have grown up in the age where Google years ago promised that they would organize the world's information. And there were all these things, systems and processes and businesses that were set up to provide all of us with more certainty, more happiness. And we would be on this trajectory where everything would be okay and everything would be predictable. And we were all screwed last year because on June 23rd in this country and on November 8th in another country, things happened that didn't seem quite right, at least to 50% of the population, or 47%, depending on how you look at it. But we were living where we felt that algorithms, tech, our intelligence was going to provide much more certainty in life, and that would eventually make us all happier, make us all more successful and more fulfilled. But things have changed, and we recognize that we had always been living in an age of uncertainty, but we were just clouded by the fact, the promise that things would be sorted out for us. And now that we're living in this very unsettled, highly accelerating, highly complex world, the things that we used to rely on to provide a social safety net in society don't necessarily exist anymore. And we're having to come up with new ways and new tools, new sets of communications, new sets of businesses and brands that provide certainty or stability to people in a very uncertain world. And the role of brands in this kind of society is even more important to provide that sense of social stability. And especially for marketeers or for communicators, one of the greatest skills, and this would be, I suppose, the question to consider, one of the greatest skills we used to have was reductionist thinking, the ability to take really complex, multifaceted ideas and distill it down to a very simple thought or a very simple brief to allow consumers to digest it or agencies to make wonderful, creative, thoughtful, strategic campaigns out of it. But I suppose in this very complex, very fast-moving year we're going to have ahead of us and uncertain, is simple the goal?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and we wrestle with this one. I think people are starting to accept that, or be more willing to accept complexity. And I think if you're trying to crisply define all of your sets of stakeholders, then in all the ways in which you might engage with them, then I think you're pretty much doomed to fail. Because people identify according to more and more smaller and smaller communities, and we've effectively become a cluster of communities. And President Obama, as he in his valedictory speech, talked about bubbles being one of the big challenges we're facing, and I think that is clearly applied to our work. At the same time, brands or organizations which think that a set of criticism in a community which seems isolated will remain isolated and will remain at some distance from being like top of your in tray, I think you can get a rude awakening there, because with the way in which social media is working, in the way in which journalists are sourcing their information these days, a few well-received tweets, or well-received from the point of the journalist, can really start can kind of come out of left field from the corners of your vision. So that has real implications for organizations and how they communicate.
And then specifically, when you think about some actions or some tactics or some ways that, because this kind of utopian, dystopian, the desire to be simple, desire to be easy to understand, the desire to be binary, good or bad, is something that we all strive for. But how can we as communicators or marketers get comfortable with that and maybe do some more effective work for consumers who are wrestling with the same thing?
So I think key is being able to talk to a community, and that community might be quite niche, it might be quite small, it could be larger, it could be broader. You need to talk their language, you need to go to where they are. So if you're a brand that traditionally doesn't do Facebook for some reason because it doesn't fit into the strategy, but you find that you're seeing a significant volume of conversation or possibly criticism in one particular area, say Facebook to use that example, then you need to go there, you need to engage with it, you need to be open as he was talking about, and you need to sustain that conversation, and that's something that you need to do in different ways according to the different communities that are part of your ecosystem, if I could put it that way. Engaging with critics clearly can have significant benefits. PayPoint, a FTSE 250 payments company, was really seeing a disproportionate effect from a small number of critics amongst its very large network of customers. And for a long time it didn't do that much with it, and then when it started to open the conversation with them and actually pick apart their criticism, it dissipated remarkably quickly, and actually some of those guys have turned around and become advocates, and it's been I think it's been a real lesson for them that engagement in that sense can be positive. But it's not all about crises and listening out for potential problems. It's using that community or those communities to your benefit. I mean, lots of brands or forward-thinking brands are using them as kind of real-time R&D, live R&D effectively. So Monzo, a challenger bank, uses its customer base to suggest and to actually test functionalities like freezing and unfreezing cards. If you mislay one, last night on the train home I found somebody's card, and that's the kind of thing that if you recognize that you've lost it, you can cancel it with these guys on the app. rather than having to go through the process of going through an automated switchboard to try and do it. So there's more widely, I guess the point is that you've got a pool of brains out there that you can use, and you can shape your brand accordingly. So find ways to engage with these people and get their ideas out of them.
And how would you, we've learned a lot of new phrases in the last few months, alternative facts, and but one of the ones that's most troubling, I think, for marketers is silent majority. And all of us spend a lot of time understanding our customers, our consumers, our stakeholders, and how do we now act on the fact that there might be a silent majority that we don't know about, and how do we create these communities for people we may not have, if we have this uncertainty in our minds about what our customers are really thinking?
Well, I think one of the key points to that, and I don't know what the other guys think, is listening to how the conversation is going, watching and seeing what's being shared, how your content's moving, and so being accurately plugged into the analytics and some of the numbers behind how the content's performing is really important. And obviously, the next level of that is being able to present it to your key stakeholders in ways in which they will understand the arguments that you're making. So things like data visualization, reporting become really important when you're having those C-suite level conversations.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, and I think James is going to come on to this point a little bit later, but I don't think as agencies we have enough thinking time. I don't think we're given enough thinking time by brands, and indeed I don't think brands have enough thinking time either. And we often rush to just create content because everyone else is creating content, when in fact I think if we just paused and just listened and observed, we would find that there is probably a far more creative and strategic way of actually tackling a problem or listening to a community. So it may be that it's just a case of taking a little bit more time to understand some of these communities a little bit better before we rush to actually execute a campaign.
Interesting. Last question maybe on this one, because there's certainly a sense that one of the predominant narratives in marketing or comms in the last few years has been the development of a purpose, like a guiding light for a brand, but where the clarity for especially for internal stakeholders about where a business or where a brand is going and what the agenda is. But this is becoming more difficult for leaders as well, to distill their vision into some clear area when the world around them is so opaque.
Yeah.
And how would you advise leaders or communicators to have that balance between simplicity and clarity?
Well, you mentioned the importance of internal stakeholders. And it's one thing that we've seen in the market over the last 6 to 12 months, a huge increase in brands investing in their staff and investing in internal communications and employee engagement campaigns. I think that sense of purpose is incredibly important, uniting a huge workforce behind a set of common values in order for them to push that out on social media, speak to customers, deal with problems, is incredibly valuable. And if you get that right, that should flow into all of your external communications. And then when you do engage with the communities, as Andy was saying, it's not just about broadcasting them, it's making sure they're involved, they're brought into a direction, and they're actively involved in the brands that they are engaging with and they want to be part of.
Great, excellent. Right, trend number four is we're calling lifelong learning, but it's almost a recognition that one of the other things that's changed in the last couple of years, we used to rely on this life journey that we would be born, we would go to school, we'd go to work, we'd retire, we'd die. And that's how we live,
Trevor.
right? Yeah.
Cheering. Yeah.
Really despair more than despair. But those things are changing. People are recognizing and craving this sense that I want to continuously learn. I want to continuously develop, not just professionally, but personally, spiritually. But this journey that we're on to be better people and to learn throughout life, not just learn in that period before we work and before we die, but to continuously learn is coming at the same time that the structure and the service and the facilities provided by traditional educational institutions are not fit for that lifelong learning journey. And more people are looking for alternative ways, whether it's books or mentors or coaches or schools that are cropping up that don't necessarily conform to the traditional models. But for us, the most interesting opportunity here is a rejection from people about turning to schools and maybe turning to brands to provide that type of mentorship and that type of learning and that type of environment that fosters a more lifelong learning journey. And I suppose one of the questions I suppose we should think about is how can, in this environment where brands may be the ones to provide that civic duty, learning and development and stability, how can brands step into this new role where they might be a partner, a trusted partner for a learning journey?
Yeah, so I think your point around sort of moving away potentially from more of the traditional learning institutions is a good one. And we heard in 2016 that we've all had enough of experts. So I suppose that's another trend that we could tap into. But for the most innovative brands and those that are more forward-thinking, there's a huge opportunity to tap into this trend. I think we don't want to see brands being too didactic, but there's a certain opportunity to create a deeper and a more direct connection with stakeholders, whether they be customers, consumers, industry commentators, employees, investors. And we're seeing, increasingly, I think we're also seeing new technologies that are enabling brands to take a much more collaborative approach. The word collaboration has come up actually a few times through this conversation already, and I think it will probably come up again.
So is engaged.
It has, funnily enough. But we're really seeing this sort of a much more open approach from brands to sort of tap into particular issues and to tap into the trend that people are trying to continue learning about the way that the world is changing around them. In particular, we've seen, I think, a lot of partnerships between brands and other organizations who are looking to educate themselves as well as others, as other stakeholders that they want to reach. And particularly, we've seen quite a few successful partnerships in the past couple of years between brands and more traditional academic or learning institutions. So a great example is Net-a-Porter, the online fashion site, has teamed up with the business school in Bologna to create a master's program which is specifically aimed at those who want to study digital business, for example. And I think we will continue to see more and more partnerships of those nature.
So is this a drastic shift away from the way we used to think about education, which was we need to educate people about our product or service? And is this a more social, more generous form of education, or is it still a very commercial relationship between?
Well, I think ultimately brands are looking to impact their bottom line, but there are several ways that you can do that. I think that there are two or three sort of points I would make here. One is that brands can actually look to tap into wider issues as a means to co-create content and to educate their stakeholders. So whether those issues are societal, economic, political even, as a means to sort of really create compelling content and engage with their stakeholders. Secondly, I think there is an opportunity to use education as a way to sort of to tap into products and services actually to educate stakeholders in a more interactive way, and also to sort of almost gamify the system, right? So it means that brands are then speaking in a completely different way to their stakeholders. The last thing actually, and picking up on something that James said, is around educating internally. So, we're seeing more and more clients looking at employee engagement programs as a way to really sort of tap into the workforce and drive innovation and advocacy amongst those who should be their biggest advocates, those that work for them. And that's something I think we will continue to see from a continuous learning perspective. Brands are looking to not only attract talent into their workforce, but to retain that talent as well. And particularly as we see technology continuing to disrupt and mean that we need to build new skills, we'll see sort of more and more partnerships again. Dyson's a really good example with their School of Design Engineering with Imperial College here in London, where the James Dyson Foundation is actually funding that program. And we're seeing a brilliant response to that, I think, as they're looking to build skills for the future workforce.
And how would you recommend, what would be the best ways for brands who are interested in this more enriching, being a part of their customers' or consumers' lives? What would be the first steps? How would they think about a program such as this? What would be the first things they might consider before just deciding we're going to be in the development or education space in addition to selling stuff?
I think it's really sort of coming back to the basics of communication, sort of working out who it is that we're trying to reach, what it is that we want them to think or do, and then thinking about how we might be able to create more educational content and ways of engaging with them. Again, also sort of thinking about, potential partnerships that will tap into wider audiences.
And would you recommend this if people were pursuing this? Does this on the spectrum of CSR to brand and commercial imperatives, where do you see this type of initiative on that spectrum?
Nice question.
Sorry.
I think it actually comes down to also that the brand that you're representing, or that the brand that you are, and your sort of overall ethos and your values as to what end of the scale that you might want to be on.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Our fifth trend, our final trend before we break for some questions and discussion, and this one is one that we'd been thinking about for quite a few years, and it's the culmination and combination of a few different things. We'd been talking a couple of years ago about this notion of stuffication, that we as people had reached peak stuff. We had just had more stuff than we could ever want or hope for in life and didn't know what to do with it all. And at the same time, we have realized over the last, and a lot of people are realizing, that we are just moving faster. The necessity to be better, have more, do more, become more, and to be seen to all of these things is this treadmill that is exhausting. And there is burnout, high anxiety, and sometimes massive depression in society caused by consumerism or our desire to be on this treadmill of accumulation and achievement. And a lot of that is the need for speed that we have in society, almost mimicked machines now. We have seen as a primary behavior to be faster. The speed of decision making, whether it's your opinion on Brexit or your opinion on this specific product launch, you have to have it now because computers can do that, machines can do that, so we as people have to be ready with a firm opinion on something else. And there was a lot of debate over Theresa May's delay, I suppose, in having a point of view on Brexit. And one aspect of that is quite reassuring in some sense, that somebody is taking the time, whether that's the truth or not, but how almost she was a pariah in the media because she was taking time to do things. And it's an interesting societal contradiction for us, where we should be taking the time to do things, but society is forcing us to be faster, better, cheaper, more effective, more efficient, and to have more and to do more. And to do other than that is seen as lazy or inadequate or unsatisfactory. And one of the other areas that has impacted this is that we as people are not logical. Yet we have been trying to become more logical. Algorithms are trying to make us more logical and more premeditated, but in so doing, they are removing serendipity or surprise or unexpectedness. A lot of our shopping now, if you shop online, or even if you shop on store, is premeditated for you. There are things you're being guided through, and we're becoming more and more aware that Amazon is telling us what to buy, or Google is telling us what to buy. And many other things are telling us what to shop for, how to choose, how to buy insurance, how to live your life. And we're becoming less in control of that and maybe less serendipitous, less surprising. So one of the things we thought would be a really interesting development in 2017 would be this rejection of speed, this rejection of that we've reached terminal velocity, and rejection of trying to do more and trying to recapture what it means to be human. So I guess our final question is this: if we're in this moment where speed is coming under attack, how can brands, how can communicators, how can businesses inject more slowness or inject more surprise or more unexpectedness into our communications?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one to grapple with, partly because consumers are quite hypocritical in what they want from brands. On the one hand, they're digesting news at a rate of knots on their Twitter or Facebook feeds and uploading the 17 different things they do on a Saturday afternoon on Snapchat and Instagram. But on the other hand, they're using new breeds of travel agents like Pack Up and Go, where they book a holiday and they don't even know where they're going. So in our experience, it is those brands that offer more magic and less logic to clients. And we're talking about the less logic in a robotic, algorithmic sense, not necessarily common sense. as you mentioned, we are in danger of society careering towards a Hollywood sci-fi film out of the early 2000s, where we speak to robots, we sit in pods, we control other things, but we don't necessarily interact with humans or take time out to speak to our colleagues. So I think it's our job as marketers to burst that bubble, to take people out of their everyday norm and get them to experience or learn new things that they might not necessarily have tried previously.
This bubble is an interesting one, because we feel, as communicators, I think we're very attuned to it because we see the news we get. But that same bubble, that same filter bubble that we live in seems to be everywhere. So how could communicators, how could brands start to burst that?
I think we've seen a huge shift on brands realising that it's now about quality over quantity. And clients have reduced a number of the communications that they push out to their audiences on email, on social media, and focus really on careful, more insight creative campaigns with higher production values. And that's one of the reasons why we've invested so heavily in filmmakers, designers, creative and planners at our agency. But what's promising is we are seeing the likes of mindfulness become mainstream. We're seeing people taking holidays off the beaten track and staying with tribes or villages and taking complete time out with no internet. And we're also seeing phones started to be banned in restaurants, so we can talk to the other person rather than taking a picture of our food. So the way that consumers...
But there was that cliche from last year that if you don't Instagram your food, did you really eat?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I could do without eating a little bit, I think. We all could. So the way consumers are interacting with brands and destinations is changing. So there's definitely hope and a trend out there. And I think it's our job. What we need to do really is help customers to switch off, slow down, and live in the moment. And one of the best examples of a campaign I remember that we worked on is a couple of clients in the room, is for South African tourism. The insight that we had is we needed to improve conversion to the country. And we knew that once people had been to South Africa, they would tell all their friends and family about it, share it on social media, because it's such a fantastic, wonderful country to go to. So we used, with the client, Oculus Rift, the virtual reality headset, and we filmed different experiences around South Africa and then took it into bars throughout the UK and sent them on a 5-minute holiday. And in partnership with an airline, KLM, the data that we got from that allowed us to retarget and offer discounts to clients. And as a result of that, year on year, we saw close to double-digit growth of UK arrivals in the country. So I think that's a great example and exactly the type of thing we need to do to burst that bubble.
And what would be, because the other area where we're becoming much more effective is data gathering, right? Through this type of work or others. But we are, whether it's customer data, behavioral data, transactional data, we are awash in great information. And how do we maybe step out of that to let our gut drive something we might do? Or is that a thing we should do? Or
no,
should we just...
I still believe that you need to make most of the important decisions based on your gut feeling. And I don't think we should ever remove that human element with experience, but we should use the vast amount of data that is out there to inform the decision that we make. And we can see through social media what people are talking about. We can see from Google what people are searching for. We can see in the media what people are reading. So if we take all of that data, we can inform, we can make a much more informed decision.
And this area of, this is probably an unanswerable question, but it's maybe one that we could discuss, but is how we could, if we have to stand up, one of us has to stand up in front of the board and say, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be what our brand is going to do. This is going to be our communications campaign this year. It's not based on data. I can't prove to you that it's going to work. What is the ways we could rethink how we present new strategies that may not be rooted in what we call facts these days?
I think if you're going to stand up to someone and say this isn't based on data and it's just a feeling, I think you'll probably be charging nothing for the campaign for them to sign off. I do think there's an increasingly importance on saying to clients or to your colleagues, we've got this idea, it's based on this insight, and these are the anticipated outcomes. And I think more brands, more bosses will want to see that in future.
Just to add to that, though, I think there is also an argument that, coming back to my education trend, that we are more and more being able to test and learn strategies, and actually, I think campaigns should be based upon insight, but we may be able to test and learn along the way and amend that strategy as we go to get the best possible outcomes.
Great. So we've heard today about transparency, embracing new media, collaborating with clients, and the importance of taking stock and thinking ahead. So it's by no coincidence that this is the journey that we've all been on over the last few months, which is why today you may notice the round that we're proud to launch Engage, a new practice by Pottinger. The idea and the proposition behind that is really simple, and we focus on providing consultancy, campaigns, and clients to help them solve some of the most pressing business challenges through communications. We launch as a 70-strong team, part of a worldwide group of about 300 people, and we'll be managing briefs for some of the clients you'd probably not necessarily expect Pottinger to look after. HSBC, we run global and consumer and corporate campaigns to promote retirement issues and products. Amazon, we run community and engagement projects with schools around drones. Volvo, we look after their consumer and lifestyle PR, and with Ripple, we work hard to promote the global exploding technology that is blockchain. And this new practice isn't just about who sits where and works with whom. It's about a new philosophy and putting communications at the heart of what we do, really focused on data-driven, more creative, more content-led campaigns that work with influencers across every medium and hopefully burst that bubble. So thank you all very much for coming. The panel's done very well. Give them a round of applause in a moment. But before we do, we're open to some questions. So please feel free to fire away. Yes, gentlemen at the back.
You talked about in terms of customers that gave bad experiences. We've got a lot of customers that have a good experience, but we can't achieve them to respond to what we do very well. Because when we send them surveys or they're supposed to come back, hardly any of them come back. Do you have any examples of the way to get all those good customers to say more things on social media?
What's your business?
It's a leisure business. It's sort of glamping.
Glamping. Oh, you're Embers.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to take this one, or should I kick off?
Yeah, go on. Have a go.
Great. Cheers, mate. I'm aware of the brand. I think one of the things that we've seen that helps inspire your customers and getting them to not only engage with the product more but trial the product more is beautiful photography, beautiful videos, and working with influencers. When it comes to travel, a lot of people make their decisions based on Google and what they find in Google, and particularly reviews. So they'll start their journey off looking for a particular destination, then they'll look for reviews on that particular destination. And if they see reviews by influencers, by their peers, they see inspiring content, it makes them want to go. And it will make them click on a Google search result, it will make them share an image to their friends, or it will make them go to your website and make an inquiry. So working with influencers and using more inspiring visual content. Gentleman in a very nice coloured suit. Yeah.
One of the trends that seems to be coming across now in public life particularly is the best form of defence is attack. Is that engagement, or is that a big new trend that we should be considering?
I think that was one of the things that perhaps Andy and Hugh talked about, so I'll let one of those answer that question.
I'd probably not use the word attack, but I'd use the word proactive. And I think what we spoke about in terms of trust was far more about being open and transparent with our consumer base, with the various stakeholders that we actually engage with. And I think that transparency lends itself incredibly well to being proactive rather than necessarily attacking or being aggressive. And I think brands can learn a lot from that, and I think the stakeholders respond really well to when you offer information and give them, I guess, a glimpse of what is underneath, what's behind certain decisions, and coming out and being very positive about your position on certain things. I don't think attacking is going to be the best way forward in such a collaborative new world either, and one in which we promote partnerships, collaboration, and where everything is instantly shareable. But I do think stakeholders respond incredibly well to
loyalty or the positivity amongst those communities that we were talking about before. So if you haven't got a bank of credit, you're always kind of standing at zero, and you're liable to get anything that hits you negatively is going to set you backwards and will make people disproportionately think badly of you potentially. So I think that proactivity builds a bank of credit and understanding that is not only good for you on a day-to-day basis, but is also insurance against future risk.
If I could make, I think the attack word is interesting because I think what there is, whether that's the right word or not, there is a lot more activism and a lot more emotion in the way that brands and consumers are acting. And that's, I think, mostly because people realize not only do they have a voice now, but that people are listening, and there's an impact to what they do. And I think the real potency for brands and communicators is that brutal honesty and opinion and point of view is going to be more important these days than just having something that is nice to say, that could make everybody happy. But maybe alienating some people or disturbing some people is going to be much better as long as you're creating some fantastically loyal, engaged people.
Saw a couple of hands over here. James?
Yeah, so obviously influencers was brought up a lot, and everyone knows it's a big thing, and it's a big way of interacting with your consumers because of their loyal fan base, etc., etc. But all the platforms that exist now are looking at sort of very sort of binary measures of success as influencer, to have numbers of likes, numbers of followers, that type of thing. So how do you find the right influencers that are going to be giving you quality referrals and the right type of allegiance and quality?
Yeah. So when we talk about influencer, it could be what perhaps was traditionally a blogger who now has moved to more of a brand. It could be a politician. So it's really about defining the right influencer from you. I think you were talking more about online influencers, and the work we do there is probably some of the best in the UK, and our network's fantastic. But we really do focus on not necessarily working with the best, most influential person. We focus on working with the right person for the brand, and you're seeing a huge increase in the term micro-influencers. And that could be because they have better engagement amongst a particular community rather than reaching mass group of people. It could be that we know we work with a particular blogger who is very smart when it comes to SEO and uses the right keywords and drives traffic and links to the website. Or it could be that they're just wonderful at producing content on video, and the client needs lots more video for its website or a campaign. So the individual metrics of engagement that we measure will vary from client to client, but it's important to know them from the outset so you find the right influencer to work with. Yes?
What multimedia channels do you see becoming big disruptors that are off our current radars that resonate with the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z demographic? I'd say Gen Z, Gen Y probably more important.
Yep. One of the ones I'll kick off, we've seen hugely explode lately is Snapchat. And not only from a consumer point of view, but from a brand point of view, and people are like Sky News, the Daily Mail, Snapchat content. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to see the point we talked anywhere earlier about anywhere, anytime, always on. We're going to see more people snacking on news, digesting it on Snapchat, reading it at the speed of light. And I think that will be a very interesting platform in future. And I know they've got live streaming and Instagram going into stories. So I think the platforms that really use real-time content, live content, one of the reasons why we're live streaming today, we'll start to see more success in the future.
Yeah, I think set against that is that trend that I was talking about in terms of the power of the platforms. It's going to be really interesting to see how the people who are generating huge volumes of content start to react. And those models that I said in sort of the medium term, are they going to build their own platforms? So some of the big newspaper groups have launched Project Rio, which is new ways of having advertising pooled across multiple what are currently competitive outlets. So There are, I think, what James is saying is set against what some of the incumbent giants will continue to do and how they will interact with the platforms over serving us content.
I think one of the areas that we're seeing a lot is there's a lot of channels, but AR, augmented reality, and some virtual is going to be the most social of media and being there, but especially for younger generations, unequivocally it's visual. And regardless of the channel we're on, we had a generation that preceded us, or generations like we have in the room, that are very verbal, very written, and like that kind of communication. But this is a visual generation that will respond much more to that type of communication.
Just to build on that point as well, I think not only visual but also aural. So having things like Alexa in the room. Currently, most of Alexa's function is listening in terms of how their process is being used. I think over time we'll see interesting uses of that to project content back to us, and perhaps voice to be the way in which we are served. Yeah. Obviously, there's innovations, particularly in services around voice biometrics. Fingerprints, for example, are not as secure as voice in terms of the number of different metrics you can have to make it fundamentally safe. But I think that might be turned around, and we'll see some interesting ways in which content is served via our ears as we move around. And that, I think, is yet to really coalesce around particular ideas, but clearly Alexa is going to be one existing platform that could start to do things in a different way.
Okay, we've probably got time for one or two more questions. Ferran.
Hi. Everybody from France KLM. We work a lot with influencers, and we definitely embrace the fragmented media approach that you described. We have to be very accountable, extremely accountable for what we do, and James knows that very well. So maybe James should answer that question.
Why are you asking questions?
But I mean, one thing that we struggle the most is actually how to measure the influence that an influencer or a blogger have on our bottom line, on our brand perception and credibility. So how, and James don't answer that one, but any ideas about how to maybe capture how effective our campaigns are on influencers?
I think the way in which we like to measure effectiveness, and James started kind of alluding towards this before, is we want to change behavior. We want people to do things differently. Every organization has a different way of being able to map that, whether it's Net Promoter Score or multiple other things, whether it's leads, downloads, calls to your sales team. The key thing is plugging in the comms function to all the relevant bits of the organization. And that's the thing that we struggle with again and again and again. It's perhaps the most important conversation is the conversation internally with those C-suite execs or whoever, or the founder, the chairman, whoever it is, who can unlock that almost functionality to allow your sales team to do the right thing to log it when it comes in over the phone, or if someone goes into a physical branch and says, I saw this thing, or I saw this on Twitter, so I came in today. And mapping that offline, online to the whole of the organization is a big challenge, but that's the only way in which you're going to really answer that question.
The issue that we have is that no, but it's actually very interesting point, because we've been trying to do that, linking to the website, but when it comes to travel, it's not an enforced decision. We're working like 3 months, 4 months, 5 months lead time before somebody books a holiday or a flight. So it's about measuring that effect without necessarily to conversion, because you can't do that when it comes to travel. When it comes to fashion, probably, an influencer seeing that dress, bang, I buy it, because if you don't buy it, it's gone. But travel is not quite the same. So that's why we're struggling the most, really.
I think the kind of next best thing, and I don't know if other guys want to chip in, but it is effectively proxy measures. So your social listening is really important then, and obviously there's a gap between what you can say definitely happened, so X and the causality, but you can certainly be pretty close, and the implications can be pretty strong. So if you track how your content is used, track how the conversation goes, and those two things are obviously not the same thing all the time, then you're left with a better picture of what's actually going on. But clearly that involves potentially a large volume of listening to be able to come to those perhaps relatively small insights.
Moving on. Last question. Yes, Nick.
We were talking about sort of side majority earlier, and how it pretty much caught everyone out, basically political, brand, agencies. down the road, Ogilvy are sending all their planners out around the country now to try and get a better idea of what's going on. Do you feel that's going to happen a lot more now, where agencies sort of start moving out of their own bubbles and saying, right, what do our brands need? What do we need up north, out west, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer to that is that we have to start looking more regionalised and more localised. I think it would be folly to suggest that we know everything that's happening on a national scale. In fact, all of the opinion polls would suggest exactly that we actually don't know what's happening, even though we live in an algorithmic world where we think we do. So I think field research is going to become a lot more important. And I'll come back to this notion of partnerships, is that I think big agencies will probably start having to work with more local, nimble agencies. And I think that will help from a regional perspective in understanding exactly what's going on at a grassroots level.
Great. Okay, I think that's about time. Thank you very much for all your questions, and thank you very much for coming. On the way out, we do have copies of the report, and we will send round on email videos and other necessary information afterwards. So once again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it.